Donc, on peut commencer. Donc, bienvenue à tous et à toutes pour cette nouvelle séance des lundis numériques qui va s'intituler le projet EHRI, une infrastructure numérique pour la recherche sur l'Holocauste, pour laquelle nous accueillons Frank Witherwall et Michael Bryant du NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, que je remercie au nom du comité des lundis numériques pour avoir accepté de nous faire cette participation, cette présentation aujourd'hui. Donc, c'est une séance d'1h30 qui se déroulera en anglais, à la fois la présentation qui durera environ 1 heure et le temps de discussion qui s'en suivra d'une durée de 30 minutes environ. Et je basculerai parfois entre l'anglais et le français selon mes interlocuteurs. Donc, durant cette séance, nous aurons le plaisir d'écouter Frank Witherwall, donc en charge des politiques et des stratégies financières du projet, et Michael Bryant, développeur logiciel en charge, quant à lui, du développement du portail EHRI et de divers autres outils techniques liés au projet. So, Frank and Michael, I thank you again on behalf of the Scientific Committee of Lundi Numérique for the presentation you are going to make today. I will leave you the floor in a few moments, but before that, I will just indicate some instruction to the listener. Donc, avant de laisser la parole à Frank et à Mike, je vais juste rappeler quelques consignes. Donc, les micros resteront éteints durant le temps de présentation. Et vous avez aussi la possibilité de poser des questions dans la section Q et R que vous verrez apparaître en bas de votre écran, soit durant le temps de présentation ou durant le temps de discussion à la fin. Et vous pourrez aussi prendre la parole à l'oral durant le temps alloué aux questions. Il vous suffira pour cela de cliquer sur l'icône pour lever la main. Et je vous attribuerai ensuite la parole. So Mike and Frank, it's your turn, and I wish you a good presentation. Et je souhaite à nos auditeurs une bonne écoute.
Many thanks, Chloe, for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me? Just quickly checking the chat or a nodding head from Chloe.
Yes, it's okay.
I see a nodding head. That's perfect. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to the organizers for providing my colleague, Mike Bryant, and myself with the opportunity to speak to you about the project that we work for, the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, or EHRI in short. And before we tell you everything about the history of and the mission behind the project, our services, and our technical infrastructure, we thought it might be good if Mike and myself start by briefly introducing ourselves. As Chloe mentioned, the presentation is in English. I will try to speak clearly, but I can sometimes speak a bit fast. So if that's the case, please let me know and I will try to slow down a bit. So the introductions first. Mike, would you say a quick word about yourself?
Hi, thanks, Frank. Can everyone hear me? Great. Hi, I'm Mike Bryant. I'm a software developer at NIOD and also a research associate at King's College London. And I've been working on the EHRI project for since actually its first phase back in about 2010. So quite a while.
And my name is Frank Uiterwaal. I have been working for the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies for roughly 5 to 6 years, I think. And for the EHRI project for about 3 to 4 years. I've been starting in the EHRI project since the EHRI 3 project. And I know that these numbers and the terms of the project phases might not mean a lot right now, but we have a slide including the chronology of the project. So that will become clear quite soon. And as a last question, before we start, I wanted to do a quick show of hands to ask who have heard about EHRI before. But I cannot see you, so that might not be wise. But maybe for the questions and answers, it would be nice to hear from you if you've heard about the project before. So the agenda for today, in today's talk, we'll tell you everything there is to know about EHRI, an organization which consists of both a technical infrastructure as well as a human network. And if I understood correctly, I think the focus for today will primarily be the technical infrastructure, given the Lundi numérique setting of this event. I will mostly focus on the human network, given my field of expertise, and then Mike will handle the biggest chunk of the talk, focusing on the technical infrastructure and the solutions that we had to choose as we are fulfilling our scientific mission. So in this introduction, I will say a bit more about the European Research Infrastructure for Holocaust Studies. So what is EHRI? What is a European research infrastructure, which may sound self-evident, but it's really not. It's a policy thing that might need some explaining, so I will briefly cover that too. And then I will explain why the form of an RI, a research infrastructure, is suitable to the needs of the European Holocaust research community. Then I will hand over to Mike, who will tell you everything there is to know about EHRI's services, primarily the technical infrastructure. So he will tell you everything about the online services, about the tools that we have, and about the design choices that are within the technical infrastructure as well. I will focus then on the training and events very short before we round off in the conclusion of today's talk. So a very quick word about our employer. So we work for the EHRI project, but our employer technically is the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is based in Amsterdam, and it falls under the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. So it actually has two functions, the NIOD. It's an international center of expertise and research, and it's a collection holding institute with a primary focus on the World War or the Second World War. And that is actually a very strong, I believe, dual role where we get to acquisition material. So we collect diaries, newspaper, photographs on one side, and on the other, we have a big research department of historians, people focusing on the Holocaust specifically, people focusing on what the Holocaust means in the present day society as well. So it's not just the years 1940 until 1945, but also the post-war periods, historical trauma, and also recent cases of large-scale violence, such as the war in the Balkan of the 90s, and at this moment, the war in Afghanistan as well, and the Dutch role, the role of the Dutch army within the conflict in Afghanistan. And importantly for this talk, NIOD has been the coordinator of EHRI since 2010. And we feel that in EHRI, we also have this dual function, that we are both a research institute, but across Europe. So scattered across the different institutions that together represent EHRI, as well as an organization around archival material, digital services, etc. So very recently, we have created a new video that tells you just very quickly the history of EHRI and what we do, which I thought would be nice to show to you. Let's see if this works. Yeah.
After the Second World War, all sources that could tell the story about the Holocaust scattered across the globe. And for decades, Holocaust research was difficult without a unifying transnational perspective. To overcome this fragmentation of sources and expertise is the mission of the European Holocaust research infrastructure. EHRI is the first and only permanent transnational organization that combines the forces of many institutions to collaborate on Holocaust research. In Europe and beyond, we actively identify and integrate information and help archives with preservation. Our expanding infrastructure offers access to scattered sources, training for researchers, and innovative digital tools for new research.
I'm sorry, I think something went wrong there. Quickly see where we were.
The many institutions to collaborate on Holocaust research. In Europe and beyond, we actively identify and integrate information and help archives with preservation. Our expanding infrastructure offers access to scattered sources, training for researchers, and innovative digital tools for new research. In collaboration with partners worldwide, EHRI ensures that knowledge is shared globally and is easily accessible to everyone. The rise of Holocaust distortion and denial, anti-Semitism, racism and xenophobia showed that the lessons and legacy of Europe's darkest chapter in history must never be forgotten. A permanent European Holocaust research infrastructure is an indispensable part of this effort. Support us in our mission. Go to ehri-project.eu.
So that's really EHRI in a bird's eye view in 2 minutes. Luckily, we have a bit more time today to dive into the rationale behind the project and our mission to tell you more. So in short, what is EHRI's mission? So as the video just showed you, the fragmentation of Holocaust research, this is one of the challenges that we cover in the European Holocaust research infrastructure. And I will give you an example just after this introduction. And what we want to do by bringing together all these different institutions, each with their own archival collections and field of expertise, is to accelerate the digital transformation of the field of Holocaust studies. So why do we do this? For 2 reasons. We believe that a European infrastructure can help to innovate transnational and interdisciplinary research. And also, as the video has shown, the societal relevance of telling people about the Holocaust is one of our most important drivers, just to make sure that this important period in history is not forgotten. And then the how. So the way we do this is through several different venues. We provide virtual and physical access to resources. So that's the institutions that are part of this infrastructure. We create a community of experts. This is the human network that I already referenced. It's not just the technical infrastructure. We train the next generation of practitioner, which means that the institutions that are part of EHRI exchange expertise among themselves and also among people coming from the outside world to visit these infrastructures. And we disseminate the results of Holocaust research through our social media channels, for instance. Then something on research infrastructures. What are actual European research infrastructures? So this is something typically described within the Horizon scheme that the European Commission has started. And this is not exactly new. I think the first scheme was already started in 1984, I think. And what Horizon does, so Horizon 2020 is described as it endows Europe with world-class research infrastructures that are accessible to all researchers in Europe and fully exploiting their potential for scientific advancement and innovation. So this is about not every institution in every country reinventing the wheel, but really the European Commission encouraging the exchange of expertise among different research institutions, not just for Holocaust studies, but for any fields. So the definition of research infrastructure, it's a facility, resources and services that are used by the research communities to conduct research and foster innovation in their fields. They include major scientific equipment or sets of instruments, knowledge-based resources such as collections, archives, and scientific data, e-infrastructure such as data and computing systems, and communication networks, and any other tools that are essential to achieve excellence in research and innovation. And as you may hear this definition, this is rather broad, and that is intentional because there are so many different fields that need to fit within this one umbrella of what a research infrastructure is. And just to give you 2 examples, you might be familiar with CERN, one big installation where several people across the European continent get to investigate the acceleration of particles in a Large Hadron Collider. That is one example, but EHRI is just as much another example where people research archival material, as in this picture at the Elie Wiesel National Institute for Studying the Holocaust. And this really shows why it's important that you share facilities, because you don't want every country to build its own Large Hadron Collider, because that would be a huge waste of money. So it's basically about setting up something that can be used across the continent, regardless of the country where someone lives, which for the European Commission, of course, means that we have a wiser continent and it's always much more money efficient as well to do it this way. So why is this important for the field of Holocaust studies? When we explain this, we usually refer to what we call the Adler case. So Hans Adler was one of the prisoners of the ghetto of Theresienstadt or Terezin. Before that camp was liberated, the Nazis took away and destroyed much of the evidence, including the documentation in the camp of the year prior to 1945. But however, some documents and pictures, they were hidden either within the camp in walls or they were left with friends, which means that they remained in existence. And then during and after the war, the resistance managed to save some of those pieces of very important evidence. They saved artworks that show what life in the camp was like. And after the war, there were several other initiatives as well to collect all kinds of material that was related to the ghetto, including documents and testimonies as well, which were then filmed as well. So Hans Adler is one of those historians. There was also a Zionist group under the leadership of Zeev Czech, who has also been a prisoner of the camp. And they also uncovered a large amount of documentation. But in the year 1946, while he was working in Prague at the Jewish Museum, he then migrated to Israel, to Yad Vashem. And then he took a very big part of the archival collection that he has gathered along with him, which means that the archival pieces started to become more and more scattered as time went by in a rather organic, but still in a way that means that to get a total view of what happened in the camp, you would need to visit different institutions. And of course, it didn't stop after 1946. Hans Adler would continue to collect material in Prague, but then migrated to the UK. And this, again, gradually led to a situation where the collection around Terezin is now physically scattered more and more. And at this moment, so you can find the collection in several places. That is the Jewish Museum in Prague, but also at the NIOD, where we work, at ITS, the International Tracing Service in Arolsen, in London as well, and at Yad Vashem. So just to get to know the history of that one camp, you cannot do with only visiting one of the archives. So how does EHRI try to alleviate this? So what we have done, this is just one example of what we have been doing. We have developed a Terezin research guide, which is a comprehensive, innovative, and easy-to-use guide on dispersed and fragmented Terezin sources. So while these materials got more and more scattered, we tried to collect everything in one place so that a researcher doesn't need to go to all these different archives, but can use a piece of infrastructure that combines the knowledge that has become scattered. And moreover, EHRI, and specifically the research guide that it has developed, demonstrates what a collaborative archival project can achieve, and also how archivists can redefine their tasks beyond providing physical access. So also the profession of an archivist has really changed. It's not really about handing paper over to researchers anymore. It's much, much more than that. It's also about thinking about a digital strategy of how you can increase the impact and the scientific reach of these very important primary sources. So that was just one example, but of course there are many, many more. And until this point, EHRI has identified across the European continent and also beyond 2,204 archival institutions in 60 different countries that hold relevant archival sources. And those sources together are a combined 320,000 archival units, which can now be found in the EHRI portal. Mike will tell you more about that later. So a short history of the EHRI project. As you can see, the first project iteration, it started back in 2010 with EHRI 1. I think this is also the moment when Mike already started working for EHRI to integrate archival collections. So the items you see under digital infrastructure, most of them started their development under EHRI 1. But as you can see, we didn't stop after EHRI 1, which lasted until 2014, 2015. We continued with 2 other project iterations. One is called EHRI 2, Advanced Community, and then EHRI 3 is also an Advanced Community project, which means that more and more we keep increasing our archival holdings. And where we initially focused, for instance, on very big archives, because that allows you with the possibility to use the scale that they have and the huge holdings that they have. We didn't stop there. We feel that it's important to also include smaller archives, which is one of the main tasks of EHRI 3, where we are now working with micro archives, as we call them, to include more and more granular collections to ever increase the total picture that you can get from the Holocaust by studying archives. So in parallel to EHRI 3, that is mostly a research project that builds our services. It's worth noting that we have the EHRI PP project, where we are now building a permanent research infrastructure. So these phases were usually about 4, sometimes 5 years, where we build our services, but we are now also building our organization. And that leads me to my last slide, which shows you a glimpse of what the future organization will look like. we are now organizing ourselves around a central hub with a statutory seat of EHRI in Amsterdam, the EHRI in Amsterdam, which takes care mostly of the coordination, the management, and the strategy of EHRI. So that's basically the strategic heart of the organization. At the same time, the national nodes are very important to EHRI. These are national organizations which gather, for instance, the archives that are relevant in either Germany or the Czech Republic or any other country that forms a national node. And it allows people to contribute to the central organization. So that's how it works. The national nodes organize, as you see under the last bullets, research, access services, events, and training and education. Basically, all the operational activities that need to happen to allow the field of Holocaust studies to keep expanding. Then I will hand over to Mike to say more about the technical infrastructure.
Thanks, Frank. So I'm going to ask Frank to change slides every now and then. So I hope everyone can hear me. As I said, EHRI has quite a wide range of digital services. I'm going to talk mostly about the EHRI portal. We also have things like a document blog, online courses, got a podcast I'd encourage you to listen to if you're interested. But yeah, speaking of the portal, so what is it? Next slide, Frank. So some people have the expectation that when you create a portal to Holocaust material, that we're talking about actual physical scans of the material. This, unfortunately, is very difficult to do. EHRI does use a lot of digitized material in our various services, but the portal focuses more on metadata, that is, telling researchers what material exists whereabouts around the globe that can help them locate what they need in their research. And we are trying to create a single point where people can go, they can search and find exactly what they need. And also we want to connect it together so it's more integrated instead of being fragmented in terms of the information. So I'm just going to give a quick run through about the portal, Frank. You can go next. So it sort of has a hierarchical structure. This starts with what we call the countries at the top. And the countries is essentially a textual report. Next, Frank, where we describe a bit of the history of that country as relates to the Holocaust. We also describe the archival situation. So that would be what are the most important archives holding Holocaust-related material, and where people can find them and how the material may relate to the most important collections and so on. Now, each country has a list of the archives within it. Next slide, Frank. And if you go to the description of the archive, next slide, Frank, we have sort of information about where you can find the archive, its contact and so on, but also where we have the information about its history, its archival holdings, how it organizes its collections, mandates, and how you could go about visiting the archive. So that's in the best case scenario. Then we have, when we have the information, we have a list of the key Holocaust-related collections in that institution. And these descriptions of the collections are themselves hierarchical. So we would start at the collection, the fonds level. Some of the terminology can differ depending on the archives and how they work. But ideally, we also have descriptions below the collection level, so of the series, the sub-series, all the way down to the individual item, the photograph or the document, and so on. So when we have those descriptions, next, Frank, we have we can have them in one or more languages. In this particular example here, we have a French and an English description, but notably we can also have descriptions in multiple in the same language for when they come from different sources. For example, a lot of cases, archival material will be described by one institution and also by another in different languages, and they have slightly different perspectives on it. So we think it's important to get these in one place. Okay, so I'm just going to skip along to the next stage, which is how we connect all this information together. So we don't just want to aggregate stuff from different sources, we also want to interconnect it. So we have here a set of controlled vocabularies with which to use to do that connecting. This would include things like the EHRI terms vocabulary, which is a set of hierarchically organized subject headings. And because this is dealing with the Holocaust, we also have controlled vocabularies about the sets of camps and ghettos, which is, of course, very important in this field. Those are derived from various authority lists, such as the USHMM Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. Now, we also have a set of what we call authorities. These are often the creators of the descriptions, the material. That would be either people, individuals, families, or a corporation or some kind of organization. We have those in authorities as well. Okay, so just to go over some numbers, Frank has already given you a few numbers, but here's a sort of quick top-down view. We've got 63 countries. We have around about 2,000 institutions with Holocaust-related material. For about 40% of those, we have some information about their holdings as well in digital form. That equates to about almost 100,000 top-level, collection-level descriptions. But below that, we have getting on for 400,000 descriptions at all levels. Where it comes to interconnecting this data, it's quite important to mention how these are connected to our vocabularies, because otherwise it would just be a sort of aggregation rather than integration. In that case, we've got sort of about 90,000 cases where this data from different institutions is connected to our controlled vocabulary terms. And that is very much a measure of sort of how integrated the data is. And I want to emphasize, we do still have a lot of work to do here. This could be considerably better and will be eventually. We've also got about 2,500 cases where we've managed to connect material that has been copied by some institution. So some of the big institutions in the field, like USHMM and Yad Vashem, they copy material from lots of smaller places around the world and hold their own so microfilm versions of it, which they describe separately. It's useful for researchers to be able to know that this material might exist in an original form somewhere else. And we've tried to make those connections. And again, there's a lot of places where we can, improve this going forward, but, it's a start. So next, I'd want to talk about how we actually create this data. I hope it's not too dry, but this involves talking about some of the standards. So I'm going to talk about the data integration, the challenges we have. Then I'm going to just run through the workflows that we use now. If there's time, I'm going to talk about the databases. And I'm also going to talk about the access, how we make this data available to other people to use. So next is, we, at the beginning of the project, one of the things we did was interview archivists to find out sort of how they managed their material, what their perspectives were. And one of them said a thing which is quite relevant. It said that archives are not like a library. In a library, you have a title, you have an author, you have an editor. But an archive is like a rubbish heap, and only we have the map. Now, that might have been some hyperbole, but I think it captures well just the sheer diversity of the material that's in these archives and the diversity of ways in which the different institutions all around the world with different histories and so on, how they manage it. And this creates a lot of challenges for us. So there are, of course, standards about archival description and these kind of things. So next, Frank. We've got the General International Standard for Archival Description, or the ISAD-G. This is a conceptual standard which says generally these are the fields you should use when you're describing a piece of material, and so on. So like how you should identify it, it gives guidance for the names of the fields and their general content. This has companion standards about describing authorities, that is the creators, families and corporate bodies and so on, and also the institutions themselves. Now we have how we would encode these so a computer can read them. And for this, we have various XML schemas. So the big one is the encoded archival description, or the EAD. And this again has sort of companion schemas for the encoded archival context. Again, that's authorities, and guides, which is another way of saying institutions. As well as this encoding the description itself, we've got some standards for how you would publish that on the internet, so people can access it. People like, or rather, people like EHRI itself. And for that, we've got the Open Archives Initiative for Protocol Metadata Harvesting. It's a bit of a mouthful. The OAI PMH, and there's a newer sort of standard also from the Open Archives Initiative called Resource Sync. So in theory, we've got the conceptual standards, we've got the XML standards, and we've got the publication standards. So at the beginning, when we came to this project, we thought, okay, so all the standards, they're well established. This shouldn't be too difficult, right? It turns out there are actually quite a lot of difficulties that we were perhaps not anticipating to the level that we found them. Frank, please. So for example, very, very few metadata archives had encoded descriptions that they made available via some publishing standard protocol. Very few institutions in our field even had like a website where you could search and see what their collections were, let alone being sort of harvestable, as we say. Most institutions used some kind of legacy digital system that was created either before or around the same time as various standards, so they didn't have great support for the standards. And in some cases, the institutions wanted to upgrade to something, but were constrained by financial or technical resource issues. Where it came to controlled vocabularies, which is usually a way you can integrate data between different institutions, there was very little use of international things like the Library of Congress subject headings. Very few institutions used that. Instead, they used their own controlled vocabulary for indexing descriptions. And finally, we had an issue where even if the data was harvestable, this was often in big institutions where only a very small subset of it was relevant to the Holocaust, and it wasn't possible to harvest just that subset. So we had this selection problem as well, that we're also trying to find how can we get only the material that is relevant to EHRI. To go over some of the issues, if we go to the next slide, Frank, the EAD, this is the way you encode an archival description so a computer can read it. Again, this is derived from the conceptual standard, the ISAD-G. EAD's been around since 1998. Which is quite near the beginning of XML. It was last updated 2015, but the main sort of most of the material that's out there in EAD format is from 2000, or uses the 2002 variant of the standard. So over 20 years old now. If you go to the next slide, Frank, for us, the problem with EAD was that it's exceedingly flexible. When they were coming up with the standard, obviously there were a lot of different stakeholders involved who had different descriptive styles and different requirements for how to take their metadata about archival material and encode it. So what this means is that EAD control contains sort of a lot of elements for things like formatting text and lists and links, stuff which looks a bit like HTML, what you'd use on the web, but is also sort of fairly document style as well, or database style. So it mixes the sort of the document, what those familiar with text encoding might be using the TEI or something like that, the text encoding initiatives schema, with a database. It's also got this hierarchical structure that follows naturally from the hierarchy of archival descriptions. But these, when they're sort of created by database systems and stuff, this hierarchy can be a real problem for using in computer systems. You can end up with very big files that take a lot of resources to parse and are very unwieldy. So going through and with all the material we received a huge variety of EAD files. And they were rarely sort of actually compatible in a sort of a database sense. So this was one of some of the challenges we had. Essentially, we had to create ultimately a sort of subset of EAD that contained what we needed, but disallowed much of the things you can do with it. So on to the next slide. What this meant is in the first phase of the project, we spent a lot of time learning lessons about what material was held in where, and how different institutions would interpret the standards to describe their material. And while we were doing this, we were sort of integrating some data from a particular archive in a sort of somewhat ad hoc fashion, and then we would receive more data and we'd have to reassess how we were doing things. So for the first 4 years of the project, there were a lot of different lessons on that. From 2015, because this approach we were taking of receiving material over email, whether it's sort of EAD or if it was spreadsheets or some other format, and doing some computer data munging to get it into a format that we could use, this was not ultimately very sustainable. And so the idea for the second phase of the project was in trying to create tools, both for archives and for ourselves, to make this process of data integration much more tractable. What we wanted to call making sustainable connections with institutions. So that would be USHMM, Yad Vashem. We'd have we'd be able to continuously keep up to date with their data. And this process has continued on really. So yeah, in EHRI 3, we would essentially take what we did in EHRI 2, but polish it, put user interfaces on it, make it so people other than IT people could actually use these tools. And that is very much the plan for the future as well, to increase availability. And so we can hopefully, let archives themselves use these two tools more. So I'm just going to run through an example of what this looks like in practice. If you go on to the next slide, Frank. So essentially we start with, we will say we're harvesting some material from the USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. In this case, we'll create a data set, but we'll do it for just one accession year. So this is just the USHMM material for 1987, for example. So we start by creating a data set and we say, next, Frank, that we're going to harvest this material via a resource sync. That is a standard for describing where some material is on the web, essentially. So we add that in, and next, Frank. And then that allows us on our online tools, which is a sort of the administrative pages on the EHRI portal, to harvest some data down to essentially the cloud. And if we go to the next slide, the next step, we can examine the material. Now, this XML we have, it's not in EAD format. What this format is it comes from USHMM search index. So it comes from a Solar XML thing, but it's still described according to the ISAD-G. So we can recognize what fields are where and where they should go. So what we need to do is then to translate this into EHRI's subset of EAD. We can validate the files here, but there's no point in validating this because we know it's not valid yet. So if we go to the next step, we'll then create a mapping for this data from USHMM. This interface here, it gives you essentially the mapping is at the top. And what that is a way it's essentially a spreadsheet full of XQuery paths. XQuery is a language that can be used for interrogating XML documents. And this is a way that was devised by Ontotext, as some of you may know in the previous phase of the project. It's a very flexible way for building up an XML document from another one. We can also use XSLT, extensible XML style sheet language transformations. I can't remember what it means, but for a case like this, where we're building a completely different document to the one we get, we use this XQuery system. And you can see here, you can pick a document, you can see what the input is, and you can change the transformation mappings and see what you get on the output. So once we've developed the mappings, we go to the next slide, then we can sort of run that as a batch on all the files from in this data set, which is from 1987. And we can also do other transformations to it. So we create the XQuery mapping to create the EAD, but then we also have an XSLT transformation just to clean up that document or to reformat it or something like that. So we create this sort of pipeline of transformations to do on the data and save it for this particular data set. Do the next, Frank. Excuse me. So this gives us an output consisting of a set of hopefully valid EAD documents. And this can now be imported into the EHRI portal. We do this so we try and make it very safe. So we don't accidentally put in data that we don't want to. You can do a dry run. We make sure you can import it in such a way that you can run the process multiple times, and it will only it won't add duplicate documents or something like that. It's idempotent in math speak. And yeah, we've through experience, we've had to do a lot of work on making this process reliable and safe. We also do this on a sort of a staging database first, and then we get feedback from the data provider just to check everything is as it should be, and then we do it for real. So there's one final step after this, which is called alignment, and that is where we connect their access points, their subject terms, how they index their data to EHRI's. And this essentially involves having a reference table for access points in a particular institution and how they map to ours. And we have this for most large institutions at the moment, but as you say, we need to increase the coverage of this a lot. But this means that when they come up with new data, as USHMM frequently does, every now and then we can synchronize the collections and then reconnect all the access points and hopefully keep everything nicely in sync. However, this is like the sort of the best case scenario. If we go on to next, we have to work with a variety of different approaches. So EHRI is a fairly small project as these things go. We're not a huge aggregator, and that means we can't say give us your data in this format, because otherwise we wouldn't have any data. So we have to be very flexible here. And the most flexible, of course, is when a particular data provider doesn't have any digitized collections that they can give us at all, or they might not have any at all. In this case, an archivist or a subject matter expert will actually manually catalog the descriptions in the EHRI portal, which is a way of creating some of the, the most informative and highest quality descriptions we have, but it's obviously very time consuming. The next case is, as I was explaining, we did a lot of in the first phase of the project, which we sort of do a one-off import from some data we get from somewhere, whether it be a spreadsheet or something, and then we had to write code in order to turn this into something we can import. The next case, which is becoming more common, is where we have harvestable data, but so we can download everything, we can import it in a fairly automated way, but there can be issues with this. And one of those issues is if the archive does a lot of reorganization of their material, as sometimes happens, or they change all the names or something, this can cause us problems, and then we have to do manual work to figure that out. And in the best case scenario, which is fortunately what we have with a lot of big archives like USHMM, is where everything is available as XML. We can download it, transform it, and also we can keep it fully synchronized with confidence. So if we go on to the next case, I just want to talk about where this data goes, if we have time. So EHRI uses a graph database. It contains not just the archival data, archival metadata, but also sort of metadata. So that's the audit trail, who's imported what, who's updated what. And we have quite an elaborate permission system so that only particular people can manage the data for whether it be a country or a particular institution or even a particular collection. And this permission system is also mirrors the hierarchy of the hierarchy we have with the countries, institutions, collections, documents, item level, so on. Just for those who aren't familiar with graph databases, if you go to the next slide, Frank. So this is just a very quick overview. In a normal relational database, you're dealing with tables. The tables have rows. These rows have column values. And you tend to connect rows using some kind of key, which can relate between the different tables, a foreign key. A graph database, you deal with what are called nodes, relationships between them. And in our particular database, those nodes or relationships can have like arbitrary key value attributes as well. So the relationship is a first-class item in the database, not just something that happens to be deducible from a key. So what this means is that the graph databases, if we go to the next slide, they're very good for dealing with hierarchies. And obviously we deal with a lot of collection description hierarchies. We have a hierarchical permission system. Hierarchies, obviously you can deal with this in a relational database, but it can involve quite a lot of complicated queries, or it certainly did back when we started. Things have gotten better since then. But this is not just a performance issue for us, it's more about convenience. And if we go to the next slide, just gives a tiny little example of how we're sort of pulling out a subgraph from our database. And this consists of, we match against a particular institution, and then we retrieve its country and a list of its items in a hierarchy. And it's all sort of very easy to do in a way that you can traverse these hierarchies that might be of arbitrary length, because obviously we don't know how deep the hierarchy is. And our database Neo4j makes it very nice to do this. Neo4j in general, if we go to the next slide, has been really good for us. Sorry, I'm going to skip this one because I think we're pressed for time. So Neo4j has been very good in about the 10 years we've been using it. It is great for hierarchies and other graph-like data. It has a really nice query language. It's good for when the data set's evolving and you're not quite sure how your data set will change. And it's been very reliable. However, since we've had it, there's a few things that would give me pause if I was to choose the same product again. And one of these being that in recent years, it's not entirely open source. When we started, it was fully open source. The version we use is fully open source. But I think for a project like EHRI, where we don't have a big budget, we try and develop everything in the open as much as possible. Everything's on GitHub, all the source and so on. I would prefer it if the database was open source. So that's that for the data. Now, how do we actually make this data available for other people? Obviously, because standards are so important to us, we support all the various XML standards like EAD, EAG. You can download these from descriptions in the portal. Generating EAD, as I said, if you have a very big, thousands and thousands of items down to item level, it can be quite tricky to manage. And the database actually gives us a lot of help in doing this in an efficient way. We support OAI PMH, and we have a couple of different JSON-based APIs. It's JavaScript object notation APIs. One of them is based around search, so you can do a search in free text. We have another one which uses a thing called GraphQL. This again, it does connect to the graph database we use, and it's very convenient for that. But it allows you to do very kind of quite complex data retrieval queries in a way that's fairly efficient. We're also currently developing a better sort of linked open data story, RDF. This has been some time in the works because when we started, there was no good ontology, RDF ontology for expressing archival data in RDF. Some people might disagree with me. There are certainly ways you could do it, but they tended to be quite verbose and quite complex. So we're now using something called records in context, which again is by the International Council for Archives, or it's sort of affiliated with them. And this is, it maps to our data model very straightforwardly for the most part. And it means you can create an open data, sort of a knowledge graph, which links to things like Wikidata, DBpedia, and so on. So this is, in the works. Records in context, the ontology is still in draft form, so we expect things to change, but we have a version in testing that we hope to make available this year. So to talk about some other EHRI platforms, I've slightly lost track of my time. How are we doing, Frank?
We have 6 minutes still have. I think with the introduction, maybe 9 minutes left, looking at the organizers.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, it's okay.
So we have a set of online editions. These are sort of websites based around a set of documents, a bit like Frank was describing in the beginning with the Terragenstad research guide. We've got two in English and 2 in German. The German ones are developed with the support of German or Austrian partners. The platform for the online editions, if you go to the next slide, this is based around a Mecha, which some people may be familiar with. It's a very nice platform for doing online galleries and so on, and lots of other things. We extend this with various plugins. We used a TEI, text encoding initiative, XML documents to mark up our data before we upload it to a Mecha. And we also connect this to information in the EHRI portal via the API. So the APIs for the portal are how we integrate our own platforms together. We've also got a document blog that I'd encourage you to read that. A lot of interesting stories. This is a space for discussing everything from document collections, research from EHRI fellows and so on. There's also stuff about digital methods in there. So it's quite a broad, all-encompassing space. Again, you can embed information from different sources. And the next thing we're going to come up with is, at some point, is a geospatial repository. This is sort of based on map data. This is quite exciting to me because it's not quite released yet, but this will have a lot of potential for researchers to create new, interesting geographical visualizations of their data. Again, this is based on some open source platforms, GeoNetwork and GeoServer. And it provides a lot of APIs, all those sort of the Open Geospatial Consortium APIs, the Web Map Service and Web Feature Service and all these things. So yeah, that's very exciting. And I think at this point, I will hand back to Frank.
Thank you, Mike. And we're quickly approaching the end of the presentation. For this Lundi numérique presentation, we gave the biggest attention from our side to the numeric side of EHRI. But just to show a holistic picture of the infrastructure, I wanted to quickly say something about the human network as well. So other than our digital services, we also have seminars and workshops. And they are not only for Holocaust scholars specifically, we also focus on, for instance, archivists or digital infrastructure specialists to make sure that we also share the knowledge internally, the things that Mike has been talking about, for instance. So the aim of that is, as I mentioned, to cover a specific field in Holocaust studies, the research side of things, but also to exchange experience professionally across collections and primarily digital collections. And then just to name two examples. So a seminar can be about researching and remembering the Holocaust in Central Europe, which is very much research focused or archival focused, but it can just as well be about the World Wide Web, about documenting, uploading, and utilizing Holocaust testimonies in the digital age. And on the right side, you see some pictures of how an EHRI seminar takes place, this one on Polish sources for Holocaust research. Then conferences, we have organized several in the past. They're often the nice also closing of one of the project phases that we did. And they're also focused around specific topics, just like the seminars. So that could also be the Holocaust as a historical period, but also the post-Holocaust world. As I mentioned earlier, we're also focused on memorialization, about contemporary issues such as human rights and Jewish life or international relations. And here we also have two examples. So we had one in 2013 focused on the public history of the Holocaust, and one of our more recent ones in 2019 specifically focused on Holocaust studies and the social setting, looking at how Holocaust studies can enrich memorialization of the Holocaust in a more public way. And then as a last service, I will quickly show you, maybe given the time that we have, maybe a minute of what the EHRI fellowships are. So this is also one of our important services. We have, as Mike has shown you, meta descriptions of collections available online. There is a lot of digital material, but still a lot of the archival material is not digitized because other than, for instance, paintings, when we speak about archives, it's kilometers and kilometers of paper. So it's a huge effort to digitize everything. And as archives, we're not there yet, which is one of the reasons why also for EHRI, transnational access to archives is an important driver to enable people to really dive into the actual underlying archival material. I will quickly move to the right section of the video to save us some time.
Engage in Holocaust research.
I think EHRI fellowships are one central part in actually establishing this human network that EHRI has set off to do. The EHRI fellowships are actually a great way to conduct research in multiple research institutions within the EHRI project.
I work on music in Theresienstadt, and so I'm looking at how we remember these operas and other performances ultimately tell us more about the way we want to remember history than history itself. So the problem with the documents pertaining to musical activity in Theresienstadt is that they're scattered throughout the world, and that's where EHRI has been very helpful. And so really this was the last archive I really needed to visit, and with EHRI's help that has been possible.
My main research topic right now is the Jewish order service in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is commonly known as the Jewish police. I completed a book on the topic, so I researched already. Now I came to King's College to add more data analysis to my manuscript.
I applied for an EHRI fellowship because I wanted to broaden my professional view, and I wanted to get out of the NIOD or the Dutch bubble and dive deeper in questions about the future of the library, questions about collection management.
So we are not just looking at the research community, but way beyond, and also want to include everyone who is actively working in Holocaust research as well as in commemoration.
Fellowships are incredibly important because they are really the main way of doing research right now. They allow me time off my daily duties and work to focus just on my research, and this really is invaluable. But just as importantly, it's incredibly important in terms of networking, of meeting people, of exchanging ideas.
The benefit of the
I think that's enough given just the scarce amount of time that we have left. I've just been to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum myself for a fellowship learning about that digital collections infrastructure. Just to mention one example where, as a researcher, or in my case, someone focusing on digital collections, you get to learn from professionals. And I would just recommend everyone to keep an eye on the EHRI fellowships and apply if they have the chance. I thought it greatly impacted my career to be able to learn from a partner who is quite far ahead on a topic that you're working in. So just to wrap up this conversation, so I think first, it's fair to say that EHRI is built on a strong use case for transnational Holocaust studies. And that's given the fragmented nature of archives that we have started this conversation with. And on top of that, as Mike has shown, the technical possibilities there are right now for linking data. So I think that connection of a problem there is in the field and a technical solution creates a multiplier effect, which really helps people not only to uncover archival knowledge and use that in their studies, but also to share expertise around these collections. Mike, do you want to say something about the data integration side of things?
Yeah, I think this slide does cover it quite well. This is still an area where, you have to be patient and expect to undertake some sort of, I suppose it's sort of, one by one. You have to be flexible. You can't sort of expect new standards or technology or machine learning or something to make the problem go away, because in often cases, the problem is a sort of lack of sufficient digitization. It's not so much a big data problem, but a lack of data problem. But things are definitely improving, and they're improving because institutions are upgrading to new software. There's people put more value on open source and using open source platforms, which tend to have good support for the standards. So the situation is getting better, and we're benefiting from that.
And just to wrap up this entire conversation, I hope that Mike and me managed to show that there is something in EHRI for everyone. So that could be a researcher, an archivist, anyone who focuses on the Holocaust. We hope to give everyone the services and the in-person activities they need to really further their research or professional career. And we encourage everyone to get in touch, to keep an eye on our website. We have the Twitter and Facebook handle just below this slide as well, if you want to follow us. As you can always get in touch with us through email as well. We have the EHRI help desk which can be reached through email info@ehri-project.eu. I think that's everything from our sides.
Thank you very much, Mike and Frank, for these presentations. It's very interesting to see how this project allows connections between sources, archives, institutions, and partner institutions, communities of researchers. And it's always very interesting too to see how such a project on this type of subject with this memorial and political dimension, with the international dimension, like the scattering of sources, both from the point of view of the history of the Holocaust and the archive movement after the war, and the collaboration between all the partner institutions, to see how this project was conceived from a financial and legal and administrative point of view since 2010 to its completion, with the launch of the online portals, the technical infrastructure that had made possible to access to sources that were previously unavailable to certain communities of researchers, because they were present in smallest archive institutions, and the convergence finally of many documentations and research institutes that are taking a part to this project. So I will see in the chat if there is some question. I see three questions. So thank you, Michel and Pierre, for your question. Michel has asked two questions, so I will read it aloud so you can answer to it. So Michel said, hello, thank you for the presentation. I wish to know more about microarchive. It is isolate pieces of documents or fragments. Do you also reference objects?
Mike, shall I answer the question on microarchives?
Yep, I can add on if you have any. Yeah.
Perfect, that sounds good. So to start, microarchives is something that we have started to work with in the current running project. So we're still finding out the perfect solution to this. The rationale behind including microarchives for us was to go beyond the archives that are already included. And as I mentioned in the introduction, we started with the bigger archives, which are often state archives. And in Holocaust studies, it has become more and more important to also include smaller archives, because they can show narratives of groups that have been underrepresented until this point in time. So that is the reason we wanted to reach out to them, also because they often don't have the funding available to do the work as state archives can, and create possibilities for them to include their holdings into the EHRI portal and to be referenced as well. That's another important thing, because at this moment, if someone has a shoebox in an attic and a researcher would use the information that is included there, there's not really a persistent way to reference such a collection. So this is something that we have started to work on. Mike has started to develop a service where microarchives could include their holdings if they so choose. And we are now organizing workshops to help them do that. So I hope I answered every part of the question. If not, I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So as Frank was saying, this is very much an area of active research on our part. Microarchives present a challenge because even more than regular archival data, it could just encompass so many different types of things, from the shoebox in the attic to collections of recordings of somebody's relative. So it's very difficult to distill what is the essence of a microarchive, and this is part of what we're working on, and we're doing that through, or we will do that through a series of workshops. I've been sort of having fun prototyping tools for how you could publish an image-based microarchive in a way that then we can download the data as EAD and incorporate descriptions of that into the EHRI portal. Because what we don't want to necessarily do is to say the only way you can make a microarchive available is to take it to some archive, hand over custody of it, to USHMM or Yad Vashem or something and let them deal with the cataloging. We want it to be a more flexible process than that in many cases people can hold on to their closely held and valued collections, but we can still sort of make them more accessible if we can. So it is definitely sort of challenging trying to figure out the best approaches to these things, because there's sometimes it involves digitization, cataloging, all these things which are very much expert techniques, but it is, like often a lot of things where the hardest problems are, it's also an interesting challenge.
Thank you very much. And I have the second question from Michelle. So she asked, do the institutions with whom you are working have been digitally influenced by your own process, data scheme, exchange, and harvesting?
I think I can already say, even though Mike knows much more about this than I do, that for us as a NIOD, there was a lot to learn. We started in 2010, and I know that our collections department has been running along with the project that we have been coordinating at the same time. And luckily, it's not just us, it's also other institutions like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem who possess a lot of knowledge in this. And I'm sure that we as a NIOD learned a lot in the process. Mike, do you want to add on?
Sure, yeah. I mean, while it's often difficult to gauge the extent that the things you do influence other people, especially since it's more of a sort of cultural knowledge exchange, certainly with institutions like NIOD that are within the EHRI consortium, so sort of working very much with us to help publish their data in a more sustainable and manageable way. Yeah, I think the work of my colleagues developing tools and things has been quite influential, and it certainly, I think, made people more aware of the sort of sustainability of data and the challenges in keeping data up to date in different places, and so on. Part of it is a confounding factor is that, EHRI's been going for 12, 13 years now, and things have just improved since then. As I was saying earlier, technology has moved on, and that's for the most part to our benefit in making better use of the standards and since 2010 when we began. So I would like to say yes to that, but obviously a lot of institutions outside of the consortium, hopefully they have been influenced positively by what we're doing. I think, we certainly try our best to encourage the use of standards and open source tools which support those standards well.
Yes, because I have a question in this type, because I wonder if since 2020, as the development of new technologies such as data semantizations or automatic character recognition technologies benefit to the project, but also image recognition. We also know the importance in this type of project for the recognition, for instance, of victims. And I think you have led some task with OpenCSV, for instance. And I imagine that the project could also serve as an incubator or think tank for the application of such technologies, or maybe also new digital method for researchers, for instance.
Yes, I say something about that. So in the current phase of EHRI 3, we have a section of work which is dedicated to exploring new technologies for improving more rapidly indexing and making searchable archival material. Obviously, there's a lot going on in AI at the moment, building on things like large language models. And these, I think, I don't want to overstate what they can do, because people do get nervous about this, sort of leaving it up to AI to to catalog material and so on. But in using them with human supervision, they can do some great things with translation of audio-visual material, generating transcripts, doing named entity recognition and so on. And we've been quite impressed with how things like the Whisper model for transcription and translation can benefit us in combination with use for like gazetteers and our own controlled vocabularies and so on. So yeah, it's actually quite an exciting time. We've done a fair few experiments over the years with machine learning and automatic clustering and so on. For the material in the EHRI portal, the problem is, as I was saying before, less big data than sparse data. So machine learning can only do so much there because there's just not enough for it to learn from. But when it comes to things like audiovisual material, transcripts of oral testimonies and so on, which of course institutions like USHMM have a huge amount of, it's quite exciting what can be done with this in terms of making it more approachable, more searchable in a multitude of different languages.
Yes. I have two more questions for Thierry. The first one is about the audience of the site. He said the portal seems to be finding aid very useful, and he asked for the frequency of the site. How much people, how much visit in the site, if you know?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, I didn't do enough homework before coming here. I would have to go onto our analytics and look it up. I don't want to say a number off the top of my head that might be wrong. So we have, there's about, please take these numbers with a grain of salt, but there's about 2,500 registered users on the portal. That's people who've signed up and registered so they can, save material and so on. Obviously, we have many, many more than that actually using the site anonymously, and we track visitor numbers and so on. But yeah, I don't have them to hand at the moment, I'm afraid. I can come back if you want to say something about that, Frank, after I've had a quick look.
Yes. So the last question in the chat is from Pierre 2. Person or subject indexing does not allow bouncing on a church. Is this an evolution that is envisaged? I don't know if you want that.
Yeah, I think I might need a little bit of elaboration on the question there. So obviously subject and person indexing and free text search are very different approaches to a similar problem. It can be quite difficult to sort of unify those approaches. It's usually referred to as the sort of Yahoo versus Google approach to finding data. We feel that both approaches are equally useful and equally valid. We have tried in the past to sort of reconcile them by doing a lot more, using a lot more expansion of query terms. So, for example, we have a controlled vocabulary of subject headings, which is in, I think, 12 languages. And we've tried to incorporate this into our search index by doing expansions and then automatically adding things to the search query. This has pros and cons. We don't have it enabled now because it has some unwanted side effects, as it were. But yeah, it's definitely something where there's a lot of potential that we have not yet explored, I think. Search is very difficult, and it's obviously advancing quite a lot at the moment. We're not at the cutting edge. I don't think it's necessary for us to be at the cutting edge just yet, because there's a lot of relatively low-hanging fruit there. We still sort of need to really to fix and consolidate on, but it does depend. For a small project like us, we can't call on legions of engineers to optimize our search performance, unfortunately, but hopefully we can find someone who's really researching this topic and able to give it the effort it deserves.
Okay.
I hope I answered the question there. I was a little bit.
Yes, I think so. And I have a question too on this subject about the platform. And you say, if I'm not mistaken, that the database is based on Neo4j as a graph database Neo4j. And I would ask if what is the system or browser behind this system? I wonder if it's GraphQL or another one.
No, so sorry, yeah, go on.
Sorry, and for the interface, for example, what is design? What is the tool which was used for design the interface, or there is a CMS, or it was developed from scratch, or something like that?
Yeah, so I know I whizzed through a lot of those terms very quickly in the presentation. So we use Neo4j. This is a graph database. We also use, for the API interface on that, a technology called GraphQL, which is not, it's a different thing to a graph database. It's called GraphQL because it's very good at querying graph-like relations or structuring queries that you can bring in a web of connected objects, shall we say. This happens to fit very well with the way we keep the data in the database, and that's partly why we use GraphQL for the API, just because it's a nice way to make the data accessible for us. But yeah, it does lead to some confusion between saying GraphQL and a graph database, but they are different different things. In terms of the interface, so obviously we use a Mecca for the online editions. We use WordPress for the blog. The portal is a custom thing. We did in the beginning try building on a variety of open source platforms, one of which was called Atom, is access to memory, which is actually a very nice database for standards compliant cataloging of archival material, and we encourage people to use that. But yeah, we ended up developing our own thing, which is built on say Neo4j at the back end, and also Scala and the Play framework on the front end. It's the language it's built in. But yeah, it's I think again, there's always a trade-off with these things, but it is quite useful in some cases to sort of control the platform that is your main thing. Mm-hmm. Because you'll invariably want to change it, or it will have limitations, and we've been able to add a lot of functionality to manage our ingest procedures and workflows that, while we could certainly have built that on top of WordPress or something, we'd certainly have run into some limitations with that technology, I think. So yeah, there's many trade-offs with these things, as always with the technology, and some technical decisions we probably would make differently now, but that's always the case. As I say, our stuff has been around for over 10 years now, so it's like all maturing technology, it starts to look a bit dated and ugly in places, but that's just IT in a nutshell.
And I have one other question. I wonder if the European infrastructure is intended to be a part of a larger one or attached to portals at the same level, but more generalist. And I'm thinking about, for instance, the Archive Portal Europe. And I wonder if maybe thanks to the OIA PMH protocol, data from EHRI can be aggregated to the Archive Portal Europe repositories, for instance.
So it's an interesting question, actually. A few institutions that have material in the portal, it got there via Archives Hub. So there's Archives Portal Europe and Archives Hub. And there was another project in the UK called AIM25, which is another aggregator of archival material. And aggregators are valuable because they have done a lot of work in integrating the information in the first place and then making it harvestable. The trade-off is, of course, that this problem of sort of data getting out of date or needing to stay timely and so on. When you have more aggregators in the mix, then it can become even more complex. But in general, yeah, we've certainly built on what ApeNet, Archives Hub, and AIM25 have done. Frank, do you have anything to add on that?
Not really, other than I think theoretically our data could be used by any aggregator. And other than that, I think the EHRI portal in itself, I always think that when it comes to aggregation, it's always good for a specific audience to have one thematic scope. So I could always see a use case for the EHRI portal to keep existing, even though, of course, the data could theoretically be part of something like Archival Portal Europe.
I don't see other question, and we arrive at the end of the time. Maybe I will take some closing remarks. So yes, so we could see that EHRI is a virtuous project that has enabled the rediscovery of and access of new and sometimes isolated archival resources, while serving as a think tank and a springboard for the development of new digital tools and working and research method. And so I think that's for me. I don't know if you have some other remarks or something to add. And I'm going to close the discussion, but before that, I will just announce the next session of Lundi numérique, and I would switch in French now. Donc, je profite du mot de fin pour vous remercier de votre attention et de votre participation. Et j'en profite aussi pour annoncer la prochaine séance des lundis numériques qui aura lieu le 15 mai prochain et qui s'intitulera « Le portail de recherche du champ, un partenariat international ». Donc, Frank and Mike, I thank you again for your participation, the presentation, and the questions and your answers.
Many thanks for having us. It was a pleasure.
Me too. So I will close, and I see you goodbye and good continuation.
Cheerio.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.